And so I'll let him get started with you, and he can tell you where he came from, how beautiful Canada is, and the whole 9 yards.
Okay, thanks, Janice. So, well, good morning, everybody. I'm Jacob Bloomberg, and I'm a member of the neuroscience laboratories here at JSC. What I want to do today is give you really an overview of the effects of spaceflight on sensorimotor function. And what that really means is looking at how the brain takes in information and then interprets it and produces motor output, and how spaceflight or exposure to microgravity really affects that process. And then talk about what the operational implications of some of those changes are. So I know you've been in this series of lectures, you've looked at different physiological systems. So this is a new system, and it might be a little bit different in terms of some of the changes that do occur. But I'll try to give you kind of an overview and kind of tell you where we're going with from the countermeasure perspective. So as an overview, I'll give you a little bit of background on some of the effects of spaceflight on sensorimotor function. Also, I want to cover a little bit about spaceflight analogs, bed rest, and as I mentioned before, we'll talk a little bit about countermeasures. And you'll see this pretty little crack here. It's not on my slide, on the screen, so it cracked yesterday apparently, so apologies for that. So if you look at how you interpret sensory information, the brain takes in information from a number of sensory modalities, information from the visual system, information from the vestibular system, which is the balance organs of the inner ear. The balance organ in the ear transduces information related to angular acceleration from the semicircular canal, and also takes in information from the otoliths, which detects linear acceleration and gravity and tilt. You also have information from the proprioceptive system, which detects motion of the limbs. And then you have the tactile system, which detects pressure on the skin, for example. And all this multitude of information is sent to the central nervous system as is reinterpreted, and allows you to move and do all the activities of daily living that you need to do. But the brain is very plastic. It's very malleable. It can reinterpret information. And that's a good thing. So when you enter the microgravity conditions of spaceflight, you reinterpret this all these channels of information to allow movement and action in this very unique environment. And it's pretty incredible that the brain can readapt and reinterpret all this information to allow movement in really an environment that we've never really evolved in. It's just a testimony to the adaptability of the brain. But what happens now is when you centrally reinterpret sensory information, you need to readapt when you come back to Earth. That's one of the surprising things that people find is that, well, you adapt to 0G, but now you have to relearn to be a terrestrial animal again. So the brain adapts to microgravity, then you have to readapt when you come back to Earth. And so what are the implications of that adaptive process? Well, if you think of how a mission works, most of the sensory motor disturbances occur during and after G transitions, during that period of adaptive change. And if you look at a standard mission here, if we go to Mars, there are several G transitional phases. There's the phase from 1G to 0G, then 0G to 3/8 G of Mars, and then on return back to the 0G, and then 0G back to the 1G condition of Earth. So there are several gravitational transitions, and it's during these gravitational transitions where these sensory motor disturbances are manifested. But clearly they're occurring during important operational parts of the mission. For example, landing on the surface of Mars. You have a gravitational transition. So if you think of it in terms of risk, relative risk, I see spikes here that occur during each of these gravitational transitions. So this is a little bit different than perhaps what you've been shown in terms of muscle or bone. If you think of muscle and bone, there's sort of a continuous change over long term, and the risk sort of increases over time. Here, the risk is sort of periodic, but spikes during important parts of the mission. So for example, here, during the landing phase here, and also here, when you return here on Earth, you need to adapt. If you need to egress and do those sorts of things, now you'll be compromised. So as a general overview, what are the kinds of changes that we do see as a result of exposure to spaceflight, and what does occur during these adaptive G transitions? Well, we know there's postural and gait instability after return back to Earth. There's visual performance changes, and what that is related to is the eyes are controlled by the balance organs of the inner ear and help stabilize vision as you move your head. And that information is centrally interpreted, causing blurring vision when you move your head. There's manual control disruptions in spatial orientation, and also manifested space motion sickness. And what are the operational impacts? Well, the impacts are in terms of vehicle control. You need to be able to see the instrumentation, so visual performance changes would impact that. Impaired emergency egress associated with locomotor and postural stability, the ability to egress the vehicle in an emergency situation after landing on Mars might be affected. Spatial disorientation during EVAs and space motion sickness will cause problems during emergency egress, and also falls during planetary EVAs are caused by changes in postural and gait instability. So what I want to do now is kind of give you a sense of what some of the changes do look like. So one of the tests that we have done in the past is called the tandem walk test. And this is a classical test of neurological function where a subject has to walk a straight line, eyes closed, arms over the chest. It's done in doctor's office, in neurologist's office all around the world. And we've been doing this test in a number of different experiments that we've been doing over the last few years. And so to give you a sense of what the postural instability that does occur, here we've got some video. So let me set this up for you. This is a post-flight test after a shuttle flight. So a shuttle flight about 14 to 16 days. And I'll show you the pre-flight. So this is the pre-flight version of a crew member. This is at Kennedy Space Center, tested just about 2 hours after landing. So this is the pre-flight version of it. And you can see our intrepid subject doing very well, as you might expect.
Are their eyes open?
They're closed when they do this, yep. And so here's the post-flight version of it. And now you can see increased instability, increased inability to, increased problems with maintaining a tandem walk. And you can see them moving off the straight line. So you can see quite an amount of instability post-flight. In fact, we have spotters on both sides to make sure that they maintain their stability. And so just to show you what it looks like on R+6, so that's 6 days after landing. And here you see a recovery here in terms of performance about 6 days after landing. And you can see it's not quite back to normal, but it's getting there in terms of recovery of performance. Here's a stickman rendition of a subject doing the tandem walk test. This is after an ISS flight, so 6-month flight. These are pre- and post-flight examples. And so the post-flight example is on R+1. R+1 is about 24 to 36 hours after landing. As you all know, the crew members land in Kazakhstan, and then they're transported here to our lab here at JSC, where we do some of the testing. It takes about 24 to 36 hours for us to actually do the testing. So this is the pre-flight version of it. You can see our subject doing relatively well, as you might expect. Pretty stable tandem walk. This is the post-flight version. Remember, this is 24 to 36 hours after landing, and you can see impaired performance, instability, inability to keep the tandem walk phase, and you can see walking off the line there. So this kind of gives you a sense of the kind of postural and gait instability that we see after flight. And if you look at how we characterize one, there are many different ways of characterizing it. One of the ways, the classical way of characterizing it is to observe the videotapes and count the number of correct and incorrect steps. There's a criteria for incorrect steps. For example, if you sidestep, you open your eyes or pause more than 3 seconds. So we view these videotapes, or several people view these videotapes, and we look at the medium score. And what you see clearly here is after shuttle, so the way these charts work is you have a pre-example here and then the post-mean here, and you can see a decrease in number of correct steps and then a recovery. Same thing after ISS, but the thing to remark about this is the ISS here, example here, is on R+1, and that's on R+0. So what that tells us, there's a much more profound effect after long-duration spaceflight in terms of locomotor performance. Now, another way that we've tested crew members from a functional perspective is a test called the functional mobility test. This is an operational test of performance. It's an obstacle course placed on medium density foam. And this is what it looks like. Here's just an example of one of our lab members doing the functional mobility test. And we have 6 trials of this. We do 3 in one direction, 3 in another direction. We perform the test on medium density foam as a way of sharpening the test to create a slightly unstable surface, which increases the challenge to the subject. And so if we create a stick man, okay, I just like this video. It looks kind of cool, so I've included it. We include a stick man here. So this is the pre-flight version of somebody doing it, of a subject doing it. Whoops, hold on. Let's see, let's get this right here. Okay, so here's the pre-flight version of it. You can see our subject doing a relatively good job going around the obstacle course. Okay. And here is the post-flight example. And you can see increased slowing, particularly when they have to do a head and body trunk motion here. That's slowed down significantly. And you can see quite slow down motion. And you can see sideways, more lateral motion as they go through the obstacles, trying to avoid rotational motion. Much wider movement around the obstacles. Also, although you may not see it here, is you have increased head-trunk locking, which is what astronauts do. It's what patients with balance disorders do to try to avoid head motion during locomotion. So you see much increased time to negotiate the obstacle course. If you look at the recovery curves in the functional mobility test, you see the results here. So this is a result of 18 subjects. And what you see here is a decrease the pre-flight time right here, and then an increase in time, and then a recovery here. If you look at the percent recovery, how long it takes to reach 95% of a recovery from pre-flight, it takes about 15 days, about 2 weeks to recover 95% of their pre-flight performance. So about a 2-week recovery rate after long-duration spaceflight. Another way that we do look at postural instability control is using a test called the Neuro balance test system. This is a test that's used in balance clinics all around the world. It's a clinical test of balance performance. And what it does is it allows you to test balance performance by having you stand on a plate, and then the plate will sway reference with you, or the visual surround will sway reference with you. And it's a way to parse out the visual or the proprioceptive or ankle proprioceptive inputs to postural stability control. And what this shows are the examples of data here for short and long duration spaceflight. These are recovery curves. So these are days after landing, and this shows the equilibrium score. Equilibrium score is a score related to postural stability. So the higher the score, the better stability. And what we're doing is we're comparing short and long duration postural stability control. And what you clearly see here is after long duration spaceflight, you see a prolongation in the recovery curve and also an increase in severity of changes in postural stability control. So the take-home message here, the longer the flight, the more severe the postural instability that we do see, and also the longer time it takes. So as you saw in the 2 data sets, it takes about 2 weeks after long duration of spaceflight to recover postural stability, and locomotor control. Another study that we've recently completed is a study called the functional task test. And in this study, we were interested in looking at the relationship between changes in functional performance and changes in underlying physiological factors. So what we were looking at is changes in sort of activities of daily living of astronauts related to things like seat egress, ladder climbing, recovery from fall, hatch opening, and then we were interested in looking at the different physiological factors that might impact performance, looking at muscle performance, sensory motor function, and cardiovascular changes. I won't have time to go through all the results. That's a whole talk in itself, but I'll kind of give you a summary of one of the major conclusions that we have seen. So we had the opportunity of testing both pre and post-flight, both in the shuttle program, before the end of the shuttle program, and then on 13 ISS. So we test them typically 3 times pre-flight, and then for shuttle we have the opportunities you've seen in the other data set to test them on landing day, and for the ISS crew members on R+1 about 36 hours.
Bloomberg,
Yes.
sorry. Did you say what you all consider long duration, 3 months?
Well, typically a long duration is 6 months.
6 months.
The increments are typically 6 months, yeah. Yeah. So this shows the summary of the percentage change across all the different tests that we see. And what we clearly see is that if you look at and compare the tests that have a significant postural stability component are the tests that change the most, and tests with less dependence on postural stability change less. And this is both for ISS and for shuttle. So to summarize it again here, is that if you look at these tests, for example, seat egress and walk, where you have to negotiate an obstacle course, object translation, where you're moving obstacles through space, recovery from fall, where you're down on the ground for 2 minutes and have to stand up and maintain stability, a jump down test where you jump from a small platform. All these involve body movement and significant body movement through space and body control. If you look at other tasks here, like hatch opening, it's really an upper body strength measure and really takes posture out of the equation because now you're stabilizing on the hatch. And so if you look at overall, tasks that don't require significant postural stability control are not changing as much, whereas tasks with significant postural and locomotor components are the ones that change the most. And we'll talk a little bit later about how these results have implications for development of a new generation of countermeasures. So one thing that I've been talking about is changes that occur after long duration spaceflight. The challenge that we have is typically when we've tested crew members, well, we've tested them about 24 to 36 hours after landing. The challenge, though, is that the more profound changes occur soon after landing. And so recently we've developed a new study called the field test, which allows us to do testing in Kazakhstan soon after landing, within an hour after landing. And so this is a study, and this is one of our lab colleagues, Igor Kaufman, who's been going out on the helicopters and working with our Russian colleagues to collect this very early data. The data are collected in the medical tent here, which they set up right after landing to do medical testing. And now we've had the opportunity of doing some very early sensory motor testing right after landing. So this is kind of a work in progress. We're still working out some of the issues with it, but what we started off is it's a 2-phase project. The first phase is called the pilot field test, which is a shortened version of the full-blown field test. And this test is composed of three tests: a sit to stand, where you're seated and have to stand; a recovery from fall, similar to the functional test that I showed you, where you lay down for a certain period of time and have to stand up and maintain stability; and then a tandem walk, similar to what data that I showed you before. So you can see it's sort of titrated to go from sort of the easier component, sit to stand, to recovery from fall, to the more challenging component related to the tandem walk test. Okay. So we'll show you some data from the tandem walk test. So this is a work in progress, but I want to show you how different it is compared to what we see on R+1. So this shows data from a number of different subjects where we've combined data from the RFTT data set with data from the tandem walk data set from the pilot field test. And you can see a significant reduction here post-flight and then a recovery here. But I think the thing to really look at is the fact that if you compare the R+1 data with the data occurring right after spaceflight, there's a significant decrement right after spaceflight. So we're really interested in capturing this early data because from an operational perspective, this is really important. We need to know what crew's sensory motor function is right after landing from an operational perspective to understand the risk factors associated with their ability to rapidly egress the vehicle if they need to do that right after landing. So we're exploring that in this investigation. So stay tuned for more results on that. So I've been talking to you about the physiological changes, the sensory motor changes associated with spaceflight, but all these happen within an operational context. Why are we worried about some of these changes? Well, if you think about now, what we're considering is a water landing. And here's an example of what a water landing might look like in various sea states. Now you have, if you need to egress the vehicle, you need to egress a vehicle that's bobbing up and down on the water in various sea states, combined with sensory motor disturbances that might impair your ability to egress from a postural stability control. So that's one of the risk factors that we're interested in exploring a little bit better and understanding the relationship between a water landing and the changes in postural stability control. So that's the operational implication of some of the changes that we do see. Now here's, as you all know, this is from the Apollo landing. This is, I believe, Harrison Smith taking a core sample. And you can see here issues associated with spacesuit design and potential alterations in postural stability control. So here he gets a sample and, okay, has some issues. And you can see him, it's quite a challenge to get back up again after. So I think the take-home message here is that we may have postural instability control after spaceflight, but that's also occurring in the context of having to operate within a suit. And the suit may have non-optimal center of gravity, for example. It might have restrictive joints. You might have a restricted field of view, and vision is important for postural stability control. So in addition to understanding the physiology, we need to map the physiology to the environment they're in. For example, spacesuits. The spacesuits need to be compatible with the kind of postural instability they might experience. So some of the questions that we're interested in asking from a spacesuit design is the field of view sufficiently large? As I mentioned, astronauts become more visually dependent for postural instability control. Do we have enough field of view to maintain that? Range of motion. We need to have sufficient range of motion in a suit to deal with falls, to deal with being able to get up, to deal with postural instability control, and also the energetics associated with that. We know that when you go through a period of adaptive change, your metabolic rate goes up because when you are unstable, you co-contract the musculature to maintain stability. And there's an increased energetic cost associated with that. So we need to understand that. And then we need to be careful from a postural stability control to make sure we have optimal center of gravity associated with suit design. Okay, so now I'm going to change gears a little bit from postural instability control to changes in eye movements. Now, we all have a reflex called the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And that's an important reflex, and most people are not aware of it because when it works, it's completely underneath your perception. But here's the issue. Whenever you move your head, you need to create an equal and opposite eye movement to maintain a stable retinal image. it's like your camera that has an auto stabilization feature. If you don't have the auto stabilization feature, the image is blurred. Your eye works in the same exact way, but uses information from the balance organs of the inner ear to control the eye movement to create an equal and opposite head motion. So if your eye moves in one direction, say 45 degrees, if your head moves 45 degrees, your eye will move equal and opposite to maintain a stable retinal image. Well, how does that work? Well, information from the vestibular system, from the balance organs, are sent to the brainstem and out to the oculomotor nucleus, out to the eye to create this very nice, very rapid reflex to help control eye movements. Now, exposure to spaceflight causes reinterpretation of vestibular information, and the implication is the eye is not moving exactly opposite to the head, and the functional implication of that is reduced dynamic visual acuity or blurred vision when you move your head. So here's what it looks like in terms of a study that was done, just looking at some of the eye movements. So subjects were asked to acquire visual targets. Here's on shuttle, make rapid head and eye movements. And you can see that for the pre-flight example, nice coordinated movements between the head and eye, and post-flight, a breakdown in that coordinated response, and you can see those very rapid eye movements called saccades, which help compensate for those changes. So there's a breakdown in the coordination between the head and eye. Well, what are the functional implications of that? Well, we know, as I mentioned, exposure to spaceflight causes central reinterpretation of vestibular information. That leads to alteration in gait stabilization. The functional implication of that is reduced dynamic visual acuity. And over the last number of years, we've developed a test to measure changes in dynamic visual acuity by having subjects do a test that involves a Landhold C optotype, like what you see over there in the slide. And the way this test works is subjects, in order to create perturbation of the head, we have them walk on the treadmill. Why walk on the treadmill? Well, walking on the treadmill provides a very repeatable perturbation to the AI head system, and it's a functional task too. So we have subjects walk on the treadmill, and while they walk on the treadmill, we present these Landhold C optotypes on a computer screen with the gap up, down, left, or right. And so, so your job is to identify the location of the gap. If you get the answer right, we make them smaller. If you get them wrong, we make them bigger. And so we hone in on your visual acuity threshold by doing that. So it's a very nice way of doing that in a very efficient manner. This shows some of the data from long-duration ISS crew members. And what we're looking at is days after landing versus the acuity decrement. And what this is the way we do the test is we compare their visual acuity while they're seated, and then we compare their visual acuity while they're walking and look at the difference between the two. And what we clearly see is a reduction in visual acuity and then a recovery over about the first week after flight. Now, what this pink area represents is we did also a corresponding study with patients without vestibular function, and they scored within this pink region. You can see at least 3 astronauts who did show similar scores as patients without any vestibular function. So this is obviously a concern for us, because obviously the operational implications of that are inability to read instrumentation and blurry vision when you walk. And so this is a concern from us as well in terms of dealing with sensory motor change. Another a change that we do see is changes in manual control, changes in proprioception. This was a study done by Watt and others who looked at a simple test of pointing accuracy in space, and their job was to, with eyes closed, to remember a position of a target on a grid and then point towards that target. In 1G, clearly people are pretty good at remembering where that target. In 0G, they tended to undershoot, and correspondingly, in hyper-G, they tended to overshoot, as you might expect. So what you're doing in everyday life, of course, is you're compensating for the weight of your arm. And so in a 0G environment, you tend to not compensate, you tend to undershoot. In hyper-G, you tend to overshoot. So there are changes in the way the brain interprets proprioceptive information, and the outcome of that is inability to know exactly where your limb position is, particularly when you don't have vision as a way of corroborating that input. Another experiment that was done was asking the question related to manual control. Is there a change in manual control associated with long duration spaceflight? And what this task entails was to it was a task where you had to center a target on the middle of the screen, and the target moved out. So you use a joystick to center the target. So that was the primary task. And what was unique about this test is it had a primary task and had a secondary task. So it's a classical dual task experiment. And what it did show was clearly that your ability to do dual tasks was impaired in flight. And actually, as the task got more complex, and that's the result here, that inability to do dual task in terms of doing the manual control task and the competing task was impaired, and really was impaired over the duration of the flight, particularly for the tasks that were more complex. And what that tells us is when you're going through a period of adaptive change, when the brain is having to deal with adaptive change, your ability to multitask might be impaired. So the brain can only deal with so much information and change, and then when you heap on these different tasks, you really reveal potential sort of covert deficits. So that's obviously has an operational implication in terms of vehicle control when crew members need to do multiple activities, for example, during landing on the surface of Mars. Another area that we see changes is spatial disorientation. And I'll go through some of the changes that are observed. One of the changes that are observed is an inversion illusion. And this is usually observed immediately on encountering zero-G. It's also observed in parabolic flight. It's the feeling that you're upside down. And so this is a very compelling illusion in a lot of people. And the reason for that is based on your own experience level in life, the only time that you experience an unloading condition is when you are upside down. So your brain goes through sort of the file of experience that it has, pulls out that and says, oh, I must be upside down when I'm in zero-G. Of course, that goes away over time, but that's a very compelling illusion that occurs. Another illusion that occurs is what's called EVA height vertigo. And what that is a phenomena where and this doesn't happen in every crew member, but happens in some. And if you read Jerry Leninger's book, he has a nice description of how he felt, and he felt this height vertigo. And what it is when crew member will step out of the vehicle and suddenly feel like they're falling. Of course, they know they're not falling from a cognitive perceptive, they realize that, but there's this definitive feeling of falling. And the reason for that is when you're inside the vehicle, you have a context of an up and down. So despite the fact you're unloaded by microgravity, you realize you're within a context and you realize you're not falling. When you step out and you see the Earth at your feet, your brain goes, uh-oh, I think I'm falling. And so it reinterprets that as falling, and that can be quite a compelling illusion. Another illusion that the crew members do report is a visual reinterpretation illusion, and that is the illusion that wherever your feet are is the floor or ground. And that's good, particularly when crew members first experience zero-G. They'll experience that. The only problem is when they see another crew member who has another spatial orientation scheme, that can be kind of disturbing. But that goes away over time. Crew members then use the total volume of space that they have, and these illusions tend to dissipate over time as they adapt to the zero-G environment of space. Okay, so what I want to now show you are some of the, at least from the vestibular system, what we think some of the changes are from a sort of physiological level, how the brain interprets information. So I've been talking a lot about the balance organs of the inner ear. So the balance organs are composed of two units, the semicircular canal and the otoliths. And the otoliths are located here in the semicircular canal. You see these loops located in the inner ear. And so they have the function of telling the brain about body motion. And when you need to understand, when the brain needs several sources of information about body motion, and the vestibular system provides that. So the way this works is the semicircular canal provides information about rotational motion. So these loops here, fluid flows inside these loops and pushes an organ called the cupula and depresses it and tells your brain about rotational motion. There's another organ called the otoliths, which is sensitive to linear acceleration and tilt. And the way this works is you have hair cells in this sort of gelatinous matrix with these autoconia, which are kind of like stones sitting on top. So as you shear these hair cells, either through acceleration or tilt, signals are sent to the brain to tell the brain I've either tilted or I've accelerated. So here on Earth, this works pretty well. If I tilt my head backwards, I get a shearing of the autoconia, the gelatinous, the stones move, and they shear and they tell the brain I've tilted my head. Works okay. If I'm accelerating forward, the shearing occurs as well. Now you may ask, well, how does the brain know the difference between that and that? Those are kind of equivalent, right? Well, you have other sensory systems. For example, when you tilt your head, your brain knows your head is tilted because of information from the neck receptors, for example. But this is how it works. You have the otoliths would detect both tilt and forward acceleration. But here is the problem. In space, of course, without gravity, there is no tilt. So when you tilt your head, you don't get any shearing of the autoconia. And so what happens is the brain, as it does, it's a plastic entity. It reinterprets that information as being acceleration. So every time this organ is sheared, information from this organ, the brain goes, oh, I'm accelerating. Problem is now when you come back to Earth, your brain has retuned that response. And so when I tilt my head here on Earth, my brain goes, oh, I'm accelerating. And that causes a conflict. And so that's the whole idea behind the tilt translation reinterpretation idea as an underlying cause for some of the changes that we see from a vestibular perspective is that on return to Earth, when the head tilt is perceived primarily as linear acceleration, that has implications for postural and locomotor control, gaze control, perception, and spatial disorientation. So how the brain reinterprets information really leads to some of these operational changes. Now, another change that you probably all heard about is space motion sickness, and that's associated with adaptive change. Anytime the brain goes through an adaptive change, you experience motion sickness. It's probably a way of protecting the body that you maybe ingested a poison or something's not right. Motion sickness wants you to curl up in a ball and not do anything until everything is right. But we see motion sickness in space, and you can see here, if you look at the incidence, if you look at Mercury and Gemini, well, there was 0. Apollo-Soyuz increased about 30. Skylab, 56% incidence. Shuttle, 76%. So there was an increasing incidence over duration of the program. Well, it could be that the Mercury and Gemini astronauts really did have the right stuff. Nothing could affect them, and they didn't get sick. But really, the real solution, the real answer to this problem is the fact that in Mercury and Gemini, they weren't moving inside their environment. So they really didn't have opportunity to get sick because they were strapped in their seat and weren't moving. As the environment became bigger between Apollo-Soyuz, Skylab, and Shuttle, and crew members were moving, the incidence of sickness went higher. So it's highest in larger spacecraft, usually more profound the first few days, it resolves after 3 to 5 days, lower on subsequent missions. And interestingly enough, you might think, well, parabolic flight might predict who gets sick and who doesn't. We don't have really a good predictor on who's going to get sick and who doesn't pre-flight. And that's the reason. The reason probably for that is parabolic flight is an oscillatory G field. It's not a sustained G field, and that's probably the reason why that's the case. It's different enough to cause a different response. And then, of course, there's Earth sickness on return back to Earth. And in many cases, the Earth sickness or motion sickness that occurs on return back to Earth can be as bad, if not worse, than the 0G sickness that we do experience. Yes.
What is your rate on the ISS that you're finding? Is it staying at about that 76%?
Yeah. It's about similar to that. Yeah. So another issue that we've recently been concerned about and now have a new study looking at is the potential for brain structural changes. So, up to now I've been talking about behavior, how spaceflight affects behavior, but the brain is a tissue just like bone, just like muscle, and it's exposed to the zero-G conditions of spaceflight. And so one of the questions are there long-term changes associated with spaceflight? We know in animal models there are changes in, for example, hair cells of the vestibular system that are associated with exposure to spaceflight, but we really don't have any idea of what happens with the human brain. And now we have a new study that we've just begun to start looking at some of those changes. But one of the big questions, for example, does long-duration spaceflight cause changes in structure and function? There's also this question about neurogenesis. What we know now is the adult brain undergoes neurogenesis, and what that means is the brain cells are born in the new brain cells are born in the brain every single day, which is actually good news because when I was going through school, we thought the brain was just a fixed entity. You got X amount of brain cells and that was it. Well, now we know that we get new brain cells, so that's good because you get older. And so, but one of the questions with that in terms of neurogenesis is, what is the effect of spaceflight on neurogenesis? We know that these cells, for example, migrate across the brain. And so those are all open questions. And then there's the synergistic effects between microgravity and radiation. What's the connection between the two? So all those are important questions. I don't have an answer for you yet. Again, this is one of the stay tuned topics that I have, but we are actively investigating these questions. So change can occur potentially at the brain from a central level, but change can occur in the sensors themselves. And this is some animal work done by Rich Boyle at NASA Ames. And what he's shown is when he's looked at the otoliths organ and mentioned how the otoliths work, you've got these just gelatinous matrix and then these stones on top called the otoliths, and then these hair cells that transduce motion. And what he's found is on mice exposed to 91 days of spaceflight show increase in this autoconial mass. And conversely, a mice exposed to hypergravity under the same conditions for the same time show a decrease in the autoconial mass. So what does that mean? Well, it means that there may be structural changes in the sensors themselves, which obviously we're concerned about in terms of behavior. So this is still an open question. So we're concerned about changes that might occur centrally in the brain and also changes that might occur in the sensors itself. So this is an open topic that we're actively investigating. Okay, what I want to talk about a little bit now is spaceflight analogs. The challenge that we have with spaceflight, of course, is that our ends are limited. Our throughput of subjects per year is relatively small. It's limited by folks who fly on the space station, and that's a small number. So we need analogs to supplement our spaceflight subjects and also to ask very targeted questions that bed rest can provide. So from a sensorimotor perspective, bed rest does provide a unique opportunity for us. Now we know, of course, bed rest causes changes in muscle mass and bone structure and function. But what does it do for the sensorimotor system? Obviously, you're still in a 1G environment, although you're supine. And so if you think of it this way, spaceflight causes changes in both the vestibular system and in the body load information, the unloading component. And what bed rest provides you is the opportunity of looking at the unloading component in complete isolation. So think of it as an equation. In spaceflight has the vestibular and body load information. Bed rest allows you to parse out just the body load information by itself. And that's important because body loading and information proprioception is important for the control of locomotion and postural stability control. So the human body has a distributed network of sensors from the head to toe that detect body load and body motion. And these include things like muscle spindles. These are sensors embedded in your muscle themselves. Mechanoreceptors, these are a series of receptors in the skin, and also Golgi tendon organs, which are receptors right in the tendon, which detect stretch. All these receptors send information to the brain that are important for balance control, in locomotion, for generating stepping patterns, and also important for termination of gait. So this is an important system, in addition to the vestibular system, that can be affected by spaceflight. And so we have done a corresponding study looking at the effects of bed rest. I don't have time to show you all the data today, but let's go back to the tandem walk test. And this is data you've seen already, showing the tandem walk, the percent correct step, showing a decrease in performance for both shuttle and ISS. Now, when you look at bed rest, so these are 70-day bed rest subjects who've been in bed for 70 days. If you look at their balance control, you can see a very similar pattern between what we see in bed rest and what we see in crew members. And so if you look, what we did in our most recent study is we compared control subjects who laid in bed for 70 days and compared it with a group of subjects who were in bed but periodically did both intensive resistive and aerobic exercise. But what it did show us was that aerobic and resistive exercise alone wasn't sufficient in terms of maintaining performance. So you could exercise all you want, improved it slightly, but didn't restore performance. So what we need is something more than just exercising from a traditional standpoint that provides aerobic and resistive benefits. We need a sensorimotor countermeasure that provides training from a balance and locomotion perspective. And just to show you, you saw the changes in our crew members. Here's changes that occur with bed rest. Just to give you a sense of what it looked like. This is the pre-example. And you can see this is one of our bed rest subjects. Doing pretty well, as you might expect. And this is post bed rest, so this is after 70 days of bed rest. And you can see our subject really experienced significant postural instability. And the postural instability you see in subject is despite the fact that they have exercised in bed, and when we tested their muscle performance is actually good, in some cases even improved over their pre-flight level, but still experiencing changes in motor control and ability to walk. So it really points to the need for a targeted sensorimotor countermeasure that deals with changes in postural and locomotor control.
Dr. Bloomberg, I'd just like to add to that video you showed of the VR+0, that's within like 10 minutes of them standing up for the first time.
That's exactly it. Yeah, that shows
how profound it is right away.
That's absolutely right. And we had the unique opportunity of being able to test them right out of bed, which I think I'm pretty sure our study was the first to ever do that, to test bed rest subjects right out of bed to look at their first responses. And so it was really quite illuminating and profound in terms of the changes that we see, and very similar to what we saw after spaceflight. And really, the conclusion was it pointed to the importance of the unloading component in the spaceflight changes that we see. So it's not only a vestibular decrement, it's also a decrement in this distributed system of sensors related to body load, and that's an important conclusion that we had. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the countermeasures that we are developing. Currently, the space station has a complement of countermeasures that include resistive exercise, the ARED, cycle ergometer, and treadmill, and those are used quite extensively. But those are really focused mostly on aerobic and resistive benefits. So we've been interested in developing countermeasure systems that are really focused on changes in sensory motor function. And one way that we've looked at is, can we increase sensory motor adaptability through training? Can we train the brain to become more adaptable? And that's important for both adaptation to different planetary environments like landing on Mars, but also important for readaptation here back to Earth. So the way of thinking about it is traditional exercise on the treadmill, although provides some benefits from a sensory motor perspective, really provides minimal sensory motor challenge. Our goal is to try to increase the sensory motor challenge during regular exercise. And the idea is to train the brain to become more adaptable. It's really this concept of learning to learn. We're trying to train you to solve adaptive challenges faster, train the brain to become more adaptable. So the idea is you'll go up that adaptation curve faster. So we can't simulate here on Earth the 3hg of Mars, but we can provide you with surrogate sensory motor challenges. So here's a closer look of what the system. So we have a treadmill on a 6 degree of freedom motion base, and we can provide a virtual scene in front that we can use to modify visual flow, and also we can provide perturbations to the support surface. And this is what it looks like in action. So we have a subject here walking on the treadmill, and while they walk on the treadmill, in this first example, is we're just moving the visual scene. Visual scene is highly polarized with a definitive up and down. We've demonstrated that that's important. So we can modify the visual flow, or we can modify the support surface. In this case, we're pitching back and we're pitching back and forth. And so we can show subjects different combinations of visual flow, support surface, motion, and train them to adapt to these surrogate sensory motor challenges with the idea that when you land on the surface of Mars, when you experience these kinds of sensory motor disturbances, you can adapt faster. Okay. So what we're now developing is a package of sensory motor adaptability training that involves both a pre-flight component, which is training the brain to become more adaptable before you go, and then supplementing that adaptability training with in-flight balance training. And that would be composed of a training system that provides a support surface challenge, along, of course, with the downward loading force to provide balance challenge while you're in flight. So help the brain remember that it needs to balance and deal with that, and keep at least the proprioceptive or load system tuned up to deal with balance control. Other systems that other folks have been developing, one approach is an approach called sensory supplementation. And what that does is it provides the brain with additional information. So in this particular case, you have a matrix of tactors. So these are tactors similar to kind of the vibrators that are in your phone. And those are connected to a motion sensor. So what it does is it tells you whether you're swaying or whether you're moving out from your base of control. And you can have a moving vector here that tells you which direction to move in. So you can use that as a means for postural stability control. It's also been used to control aircraft as well. So you can either control your body or you can control an aircraft as well. And so this is another way of providing sensory supplementation or additional information to the brain for control. And this just shows some data showing balanced performance on an unstable surface with the tactors and without the tactors, and how the tactor system improves balance control. This is really a simple set of 2 tactors was sufficient to improve balance control. So this is a way of providing additional information to the brain. Another methodology might be, in addition to what we've talked about, is providing tactile information to the bottom of the feet. We've looked at this over a number of years, and our Russian colleagues also have looked at this a little bit more extensively as well. And what it means is whenever you move or whenever you stand, pressure information for the bottom of the feet is quite important for postural and locomotor control. If you, for example, anesthetize the bottom of the feet, you increase postural. So the bottom of the feet are really incredible sensors involved in postural and locomotor control. Of course, the unloading conditions of spaceflight changes that response, but we found in a study that we did several years ago, if you provide pressure, sustained pressure to the bottom of the feet, you can restore postural stability control. In this case, we were looking at a response called the anticipatory postural response. It turns out that, for example, if you move your arm here in 1G, even before you move your arm, your brain sends signal to the muscles of your legs and back to compensate for that perturbation, because basically the brain knows it's coming. In 0G, that response disappears. But if you add pressure to the bottom of the feet, you restore that function. So something as simple as that can help the brain remember. And our Russian colleagues have gone even further and created pressure boots, for example, that provide alternating pressure to the bottom of the feet, similar to what you'd get during overground locomotion. So that's another area of interest as well. And so what I'm going to end up is, of course, one of the big countermeasure that we all talk about is artificial gravity, right? That's where we all want to eventually, hopefully, get to. Of course, the concept, the Wernher von Braun concept, this is, of course, from 2001: A Space Odyssey, but obviously the concept is significant to provide an artificial gravity environment for long-duration spaceflight. It could be in the system conceived by Wernher von Braun. It could be also a rotating ship where you have a ship with a long arm here and it's rotated around that way. That's another way of providing artificial gravity. Of course, these are great concepts. Of course, they come with significant operational and cost disadvantages. And so the way I see it is, I think we can create a series of countermeasures for our first missions and then evolve to artificial gravity down the road as we move closer and closer to really leaving the planet on a regular basis. And so another way of providing centrifugation information is with a short arm centrifuge. So you can rotate the whole ship, or you can actually provide artificial gravity while in the ship with a short arm centrifuge. And there's been also concepts to use artificial gravity and combine it with exercise. Here's a system that was developed to provide both aerobic exercise and expose them to artificial gravity. Problem, of course, with artificial gravity, there are several problems. There's a sensorimotor problem associated with artificial gravity, and that's called the Coriolis effect. That is, when you move your head in a rotating environment, it can be quite disruptive. If you've ever rode the teacups and you move your head while you ride the teacups, it's pretty compelling. And so the same concept occurs in a rotating environment when you move your head, and that's because the semicircular canals are all being stimulated when you move your head simultaneously in an environment like that. And so that creates significant disturbances. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to explore as we move out into the world of artificial gravity. And there's actually a new program being stood up by the Human Research Program to investigate some of these issues associated with artificial gravity. So that concludes what I wanted to say. So be happy to take any questions if you have them, and thank you for your attention.
I have a question.
Yeah.
As you talked about, and I know that all of the astronauts go through the same rigorous training to, maintain health down here and before they do the flight. You didn't talk about whether in you all studies, have you seen a difference in men and women on the long duration?
Well,
who recovers quicker?
Right, that's a good question. We haven't seen a difference between men and women, but I would add a caveat to that is of course our N is small with women. So I would hold off on whether we don't see a significant difference up to this point. But again, the N is small, and so but the interesting thing that we do see in our data is there's a significant amount of variability across subjects in their ability to readapt and adapt. And so individuals might have their own propensity for adaptation that varies by each individual. In fact, this is a topic of interest for us. We have a research project now in our lab to look for predictors of adaptability. Can we predict who's going to be a fast adapter and who's going to be a slower adapter? And the reason that we want to do this is we want to fine-tune our training for each individual's adaptive propensity. So for example, we know that people who are more visually dependent for postural and locomotor control tend to be slower adapters because they're using primarily one channel for adaptation. What we do in our training is move them away from being primarily visual adapters to using other sensory modalities like the vestibular system, proprioceptive system, and make them tap off other those sources of information. So it's a way for us to provide an individualized prescription of training that can help you then. So we're not interested in, for example, selection. We're more interested in fine-tuning our training for each individual's adaptive propensity. But yeah, there's individual differences like that, so that we do see, yeah.
Do you have any sense whether a non-1G, like Mars 3G, is going to be easier or harder to adapt to?
Yeah, this is this question of threshold. You know, and it's one of the questions that the AG folks are interested in is what level of threshold is enough, right? Do you need a 1G? Can you get away with half a G? And we really don't have the answer to that question. What is the threshold? It's an important question, but really we don't quite know yet where the threshold occurs. Because if we do find out the threshold is not 1G, that you can get away with half a G and be perfectly fine, or a third of a G, then that simplifies things a little bit. But we don't have an answer to that question yet.
I mean, the Apollo guys, when they were not in the spacesuits, but like in the cabin or lander, any comments that they had about it?
You mean how they adapted to my take on, I'm not sure about their particular comments, but my take on it is at least that going from a 0G to at least a sixth of a G is going to be easier than going from 0 to 1G, only because the implications of falling are somewhat reduced in terms of the impact forces and those types of things. So that on its own is probably a mitigating factor. Yeah. Yep.
So you touched a lot on the short-term effects of ocular health. What about the long-term? Are there any implications that it's affecting eyesight down the road, or is it just the adjustment?
So that's a good question. I mean, at the moment, we don't know about long-term structural changes, and we're very interested. In fact, when we're scheduling now the testing for our brain imaging that we do on crew members, we now schedule 1 6 months and then 1 year after. Typically for behavior, we don't test beyond the 30-day limit. So we are looking at that from a structural perspective and looking at potential long-term changes in terms of brain structure and function. So the answer is we don't know yet, but we'll soon get an answer to that in the next few years.
Do you see when you do the body does 0G adaptation, does that carry over from the wake state to the dream state, where they dream differently because of they're now in a...
Well, one thing that anecdotally that we hear from crew members is on their first few nights back, they feel like they're floating when they're in bed. So yeah, that's a very, very common anecdotal response that we do here. And actually, it seems so. In essence, it seems kind of surprising because you think they'd feel really hard pressed in their bed in the 1G environment, right? Sort of counterintuitive. But that's a very common response. So I think what's happening is the brain is going through an adaptive change, and it doesn't happen like a switch. It happens over time, and so the brain is going through these periods of adaptation, and there may be breakouts from one adaptive state to another. And so you may jump, as you're making that adaptive transition, may jump from one state to another like a quantal jump. And it's with that you may go from one state to another, and perhaps during sleep you do experience that. Yeah.
You seem to say that with subsequent flights that the intensity is decreased. Are there plans, I assume, then to look at our one-year astronauts and compare?
Absolutely. In fact, we have the opportunity. We tested our one-year crew member in our study, in our functional test study, and we'll be testing him again after the one-year flight and comparing his data. And so that was one of the criteria, or one of the selection criteria for studies, was that if you had data from him from previous studies that you can compare it with. So definitely we'll be doing that, yeah, and looking at the difference between the two. Yep. I think Chris, you were, yeah. You were,
I was just gonna ask, in the mouse study about the autonomic mass,
yeah,
you found that it increased in microgravity.
yeah.
Did he also keep some mice afterward to see if it came back to quote unquote normal?
I believe they sacrificed all the mice. Yeah. It would have been nice to. Yeah, it's an end problem, right?
Yeah, no,
You'd have to fly a lot of mice to do that. So, but yeah, it's a good question because that is important. What is the readaptation curve from a structural perspective, and how does that relate to behavior? Yeah, absolutely.
And then with the short arm centrifuge thing, does that help you adapt to cycling only? I mean, as soon as you would come back to Earth and move your head.
Well, I think I'm using, yeah, I agree. One of the problems with, I think, doing cycling is you're not interacting from a postural stability control in the 1G environment. So I think if we were designing that from a sensory motor perspective, we'd have them standing at least and doing something while they were standing and get an axial load, and then that would be better than passively moving in that environment. Yeah, with head movements, yeah.
The data that you reported on, does that include Russian astronauts, ESA, JAXA, or is it just?
It depends on the study. When I showed you, for example, the results from our obstacle course test, the functional mobility test, that include data from both astronauts and cosmonauts. Some of our more recent studies, we focus mostly on astronauts and ESA crew members. It depends on the study. And our field test, we have a joint agreement with our Russian colleagues to test cosmonauts as well. So it just depends on the study. So it's a mix.
I realize you can't actually get any data at this point, but do you have an idea on when the astronaut identifies a visual acuity change in ascent, or is it once they are in LEO?
Well, we would assume that anytime you go through an adaptive change, you're going to see it on ascent as well. We just don't have as much information on that just because of the challenge of testing during that time period. So we have most of our data on the return end of it. But there's nothing to say that they're not experiencing that as well during ascent as they do during descent, because they are going through an adaptive change. It's just that we don't have that information as well as we have for the post-flight example. Yeah.
Are there any thoughts, like for landing on Mars after you've been in zero G for a long time, of using like an exoskeleton concept where the computer adjusts for your ability to do the movements that you used to do?
Yeah. So people have been talking about an exoskeleton for two reasons. One is the reason you mentioned, to provide kind of an assist feature immediately post-flight. Also, there's folks working on potentially using it as an exercise device too, because if you wear the exoskeleton and put a resistance exercise and do squats, you can provide a resistance with the exoskeleton on. So there are folks working on that. I think at the end of the day, I think those are all good ideas, but you do want to help the brain adapt to that environment as soon as possible too. Because if you wear the exoskeleton and keep wearing it, you probably won't adapt. So it may be a good thing initially to rely on it, but eventually you probably want to tune it out and stop using it, and then move to getting your own brain to control performance. Yeah, but it could be used as a transitional countermeasure. Absolutely. Yeah.
I noticed one of the items that was not on your list was fine motor control. Is that
Yeah.
something that's for the future, or is that not as big?
Yeah, I didn't have a chance. As part of our functional task test study, we looked at fine motor control. We looked at force control, and then we looked at fine motor control using classical pegboard task, where you have pegs where you put in corresponding holes. And we, interestingly enough, for bed rest, we didn't see much change in fine motor control. For short duration, we did see a little bit increase in decrement in ISS crew members in fine motor control, but it wasn't large. It wasn't as big an effect, for example, as the postural and locomotor changes, but there was some effect associated with that. But we also think the effect might be multimodal too, in the sense that when you're doing a fine motor test, it's not only, say for example, you're putting a peg in a hole with a corresponding slot. Yes, it's a test of fine motor control, but there's visual acuity responsible for that. So if your head is slightly moving and your acuity is down, if your spatial orientation is changed a little bit, that might affect performance. So in a way, when we talk about fine motor control in a context like that, is it really fine motor control completely isolated from everything else? And maybe it's not. So we have to be careful how we interpret those data as well. But in a general sense, in terms of overt responses, we don't see a big change in fine motor control in our studies.
Actually, a comment on that, we have a fine motor control experiment up on the one-year mission right now as part of our human research
Yes,
program.
and
Dr. Holden is our PI for that.
yeah. And what's nice about that study is challenges the subjects a little bit more than and one of the problems, with, of course, when you have a negative result is, did you challenge them enough? And so what's nice about your new study, and the new study, is the fact that it's a more challenging set of fine motor tasks that will then explore that topic a little bit better. Yeah.
And then one thing, you mentioned emergency egress, with the capsule. Have you been involved in the discussions with Orion about this exercise requirements? That we're trying to get a physiological effect to make sure that the member can actually physically make it out, but then we've talked about the sensory motor.
Yeah, and we've been having discussions about a sensory motor requirement for the MPCV, and adding a balance challenge system onto the MPVC system. But of course, the challenge that we have is we have this, for all exercise system, the size of a shoebox. So, it's quite a challenge to try to fit every countermeasure from an exercise, aerobic to resistive to sensory motor, into the size. So that's our challenge. So yes, we've had discussions, but it's not going to be easy.
Well, Dr. Bloomberg, thank you very much. Do you have a slide that has your contact information if they have a...
I'm on Global.
Global.
Yeah, I'm on Global. So
All right.
if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah, sure thing.
And do we have, I don't know if we have yes, your lab tour, good.
Oh yeah, that's
Exactly.
okay. Yeah, we have a lab tour on the 20th.
On the 20th,
Yeah.
exactly. I wanted to make sure we highlighted that.
Yeah.
So we thank you for what you've done here with the lecture, and it's been very interesting, and we want to encourage everybody to please sign up for the lab tour on the 20th of August. The next lecture we have is EVA analogs with Andrew Abercrombie, and that one is going to be on August 18th here at 9 o'clock in here. You all information about that has nothing to do with the Human Systems Academy. However, there is a this is something that Dr. Davis and the center wants to make sure that all of the employees, and that's all I have. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.